Max Walker is just an ordinary guy living in Chicago, until his life takes a wild turn when he accidentally discovers strange abilities. But what do you do when your powers feel more like a curse than a gift? As Max struggles to control his newfound talents, every attempt seems to lead to disaster. Can he ever truly master his power? And who is behind the mysterious wave of crime sweeping the city? When a determined journalist, Emily, steps into Max's life, their investigation begins to uncover shocking truths. But does Max have the courage to face the rising threat? What kind of hero can he become when his powers seem to betray him at every turn? Most importantly, will he have enough time to save the city from destruction? Chapter 1: A Super Day in the Ordinary Life. Max Walker's day started like any other. His alarm rang at 7:30 a.m. sharp, jolting him out of a dreamless sleep. He blinked against the morning light filtering through the cheap blinds of his small Chicago apartment, his brain taking its sweet time to catch up. With a heavy sigh, Max swung his legs over the side of the bed and stared blankly at the digital clock. Another day, another dollar. Or, in Max's case, another day stuck in the same monotonous cycle. He brushed his teeth without really looking in the toothpaste-streaked mirror, threw on a wrinkled button-up shirt, and grabbed the first pair of jeans he found. No one at Tech Solutions Limited cared about what Max wore anyway. He was just another face in a sea of cubicles, tucked away in his little corner near the coffee machine, where no one would notice unless the copier jammed. And it jammed a lot. Another day in paradise. Grabbing his bag, Max headed out. The wind off Lake Michigan was sharp that morning, biting his face as he walked down the street toward the L train. The usual mix of commuters surrounded him: students, office workers, and tourists. Most of them absorbed in their phones, already lost in the day's grind. Max glanced at his phone. 8:12 a.m. same time, same place, just like every weekday for the last 5 years. He sighed again, knowing that today wouldn't be any different. Max was invisible. Well, not literally. People saw him, but they didn't really see him. Even he wasn't sure who he was anymore, just another guy blending into the background. Later that afternoon, the day was as uneventful as ever. Max was buried in a stack of Excel spreadsheets, trying to fix a bug in a system that didn't matter to anyone except the obsessive IT manager, Mr. Chambers. His desk was a mess of empty coffee cups, and the soft drone of computers filled the air. Maybe I should have been a barista. At least there's free coffee. The office was buzzing with hushed conversations, tapping keyboards, and the constant hum of the office printer. Max had stopped paying attention to it all a long time ago, content to remain in his little corner of the world. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting strange shadows over the rows of cubicles. Max looked up, half expecting the power to go out completely. But the light stabilized. Then, a loud bang from the street outside shattered the office's quiet. Everyone rushed to the windows, murmuring in confusion. Max joined the crowd, peeking over the shoulder of a coworker. Across the street, a construction site had gone haywire. Sparks flew from a malfunctioning transformer, and workers scrambled to get control of the chaos. Max turned back toward his desk, thinking it was nothing more than an unfortunate accident. But then, something strange happened. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over him, and a strange, tingling sensation shot through his body. Whoa, what the hell? He blinked, his vision blurred, and his head buzzed with static, like the hum of a badly tuned radio. Max rubbed his temples, shaking it off. Must be the 3 cups of stale office coffee, he thought. But this was more than just caffeine jitters. By the time Max got home, the strange sensation still hadn't left him. It buzzed under his skin like static electricity, but he dismissed it as stress from the day. Throwing his keys on the counter, Max slumped onto the couch and grabbed the TV remote. But as his hand stretched out to grab it, something weird happened. The remote slid across the table, straight into his hand, without him even touching it. What the? No way. Max sat there, staring at the remote like it had just come to life. His first instinct was to laugh it off, but the tingling sensation in his fingers told him otherwise. Something strange was happening, and he couldn't just brush it off. Okay, let's see if I'm losing it. He glanced around the room, eyes landing on an old takeout menu lying on the coffee table. Max took a deep breath, extended his hand, and focused. Just like he'd seen in the movies. The menu quivered, then slowly lifted an inch off the table. It floated lazily into his hand, where Max immediately dropped it in shock. No. No, no, no. This isn't happening. But it was happening. Max stared at his hands, half expecting them to glow or spark, but they looked as ordinary as ever. Ordinary. That was the word that best described Max's life. Ordinary job, ordinary apartment, ordinary guy. But now. He had powers. Great. I can levitate a takeout menu. Some superhero I'd be. The next morning, Max woke up feeling different. The tingling sensation had dulled, but it was still there, like a soft hum beneath his skin. He spent the day distracted, replaying the events of the previous night over and over in his mind. By the time he rode the train home, the weight of his thoughts hung over him like a storm cloud. What now? What now, indeed? Max wasn't a superhero. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to be. But something had shifted, and whether he liked it or not, his life was about to get a whole lot more complicated. Max didn't know it yet, but his days of being invisible were over. How are you enjoying the start of Max's journey? What do you think lies ahead for him? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share your predictions. This is just the beginning. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Chapter 2, The Perks of Being a Subpar Hero. Max Walker was determined. Sort of. After discovering his powers, well, if you could even call them that, he decided it was time to put them to good use. He wasn't quite sure how yet, but the idea of becoming a superhero had lodged itself in his brain. He couldn't just sit around and float coffee mugs. No, Max needed a mission. He started his day with a plan. First, a quick search on Google. Where do superheroes find crimes? The screen filled with news articles, superhero fan blogs, and endless Reddit discussions about what superheroes would do if they were real. Max frowned. This isn't helping, he muttered. Next, he tried something more practical. He grabbed a notebook and jotted down a list. Stop a crime. Rescue someone. Prevent a disaster. He stared at the page, tapping his pen against his lip. Okay, but how do I find a crime? Max realized he didn't exactly live in Gotham City. It wasn't like muggings or bank robberies were happening on every corner. The closest thing to action he'd seen was a guy arguing with a parking meter. Maybe if he wandered around long enough, something would pop up. With his hoodie zipped up and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, Max set off for downtown Chicago. He didn't have a costume, yet. He figured it was too early for that. Baby steps. An hour later, he was regretting everything. Max stood at the corner of Wabash and Washington, staring blankly at tourists taking selfies near Cloud Gate, the giant chrome sculpture everyone called the Bean. He sighed. Not exactly a hotspot for crime. What am I doing? He leaned against a lamppost, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd for anything remotely suspicious. Nothing. Just the usual parade of busy Chicagoans and camera-happy tourists. Max felt ridiculous. Then, out of nowhere, he heard a crash. The sound echoed through the air, followed by a startled cry. Max's heart leapt into his throat. This is it. He whipped his head around, looking for the source of the commotion. Across the street, an old woman stood in shock as her grocery bags spilled onto the pavement. A yellow cab had swerved around the corner too quickly, knocking the bags out of her hands before speeding away. The driver didn't even slow down. The groceries were scattered everywhere, cans rolling into the street, a loaf of bread crushed underfoot. The woman looked helpless. Max felt a surge of adrenaline. His first act of heroism. It wasn't stopping a bank robbery, but it was a start. He sprinted across the street, dodging pedestrians as he made his way toward the scene. "Ma'am, don't worry. I got this." The woman looked at him with a mixture of confusion and mild alarm. Max didn't notice. His eyes were locked on the mess of groceries. "This is it," he whispered to himself. "Time to shine." Max stretched out his hands, focusing on the scattered cans of soup and the crushed loaf of bread. His palms tingled as he willed the objects to move. First, the loaf of bread. It wobbled slightly, then hovered a few inches off the ground. Slowly, it floated toward the woman's feet. Success! Max's chest swelled with pride. Next, he turned his attention to the can of soup. It lifted off the ground, but as it moved toward her, it tipped over, rolling under a nearby parked car. "Oops, hold on," Max mumbled, his cheeks flushing. He stretched his hands out again, concentrating harder this time. The box of cereal lifted off the ground. Max's brow furrowed as he guided it toward her. The box trembled in midair, then, crash, exploded, sending cereal everywhere. Cornflakes scattered across the sidewalk. The woman blinked, staring at the mess in stunned silence. Max forced a smile. I can fix that. Just 1 second. Finally, Max turned his focus on the heaviest item, a gallon of milk. He clenched his fists, pouring every bit of mental energy into lifting the jug. Slowly, shakily, it rose into the air. Max could feel sweat beading on his forehead as he guided it toward her, the jug wobbling dangerously in the air. Just as it reached the woman, the gallon slipped from Max's control. In one dramatic arc, the jug flipped and splattered across the sidewalk, soaking her shoes in milk. The woman gasped, looking down at her drenched shoes in disbelief. Max's face turned bright red. I can buy you new groceries," Max stammered. By the time Max stumbled back to his apartment, he was humiliated beyond belief. His big debut as a hero had turned into a full-blown disaster. He had tried to help someone, and instead, he'd soaked an old lady in milk and scattered cornflakes all over the sidewalk. Max flopped onto his couch, staring up at the ceiling in defeat. Well, that was an epic fail. He reached for his phone and texted Ben, his best friend and the only person who knew about his powers. "Don't ask." Ben's reply came almost instantly. "How'd the hero thing go?" Max groaned, rolling his eyes. "That bad, huh? You should have just stayed home and played video games. At least there, your failures aren't public." Max chuckled despite himself. "Thanks, man. Very supportive." The next day, Max was back at it. He couldn't give up after one bad attempt. Well, 2 bad attempts, if you counted the cereal incident. No, Max needed to prove to himself that his powers could actually help people. This time, he decided to try something more direct. Instead of wandering aimlessly, Max headed for a part of town where things were a little rougher. He figured his chances of finding someone in trouble were higher there. It wasn't the worst part of the city, but it definitely wasn't full of tourists taking selfies. As Max walked down a side street, he heard it, a heated argument coming from an alley nearby. He slowed his pace, peering around the corner. A man was arguing with a woman, his voice rising angrily. Max couldn't make out what they were saying, but the woman's body language screamed distress. This is it, Max thought, his heart pounding. A real chance to help. He took a deep breath and stepped into the alley. Hey! Leave her alone! Max shouted, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The man turned, his face twisted in anger. He was big. Much bigger than Max had expected. Mind your own business, kid, the man growled, taking a step toward Max. Max's stomach dropped, but he couldn't back down now. He focused, trying to summon the same energy he'd used to lift the groceries. I said, leave her alone. Max stretched out his hands, focusing on the man's coat, willing it to lift off him and make a dramatic statement. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the coat shifted slightly. Max gritted his teeth, focusing harder. The coat tangled around the man's arms, causing him to stumble. For a brief second, Max felt victorious. But then, the man growled again, untangling himself and charging toward Max. Max panicked. His powers failed him completely, and in a rush of adrenaline, he turned and ran. Max didn't stop running until he was halfway down the block, panting and clutching his side. He glanced back, relieved to see that the man hadn't followed him. The woman had fled, too, likely running in the opposite direction. Max leaned against a wall, catching his breath. That could have gone better, he muttered. By the time he got back to his apartment, Max felt defeated all over again. His second attempt at heroism had been just as bad, if not worse, than the first. He flopped onto his couch, staring at the ceiling once more. What am I doing wrong? His phone buzzed. It was Ben again. So, how'd it go this time? Max groaned and tossed the phone aside. He didn't bother responding. Despite everything, Max couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. Sure, both attempts had ended in disaster, but he hadn't given up. He was still trying, and that had to count for something. He wasn't a hero yet. But maybe, just maybe, he was on the right track. Chapter 3, The Hero Nobody Needs. Max Walker was losing faith in the whole superhero thing. His first two attempts at heroism had ended in spectacular failure, first the grocery incident with the old woman, and then the disastrous alley encounter. If this was what being a hero felt like, Max wasn't sure he wanted any part of it. He hadn't exactly expected to be flying around in a cape, saving the world on day one, but he hadn't expected to be quite this terrible at it either. Max sat at his kitchen table, staring down at his half-eaten bowl of cereal, his mind 1,000 miles away. The milk was starting to get warm, but he hadn't touched the spoon in minutes. The truth was, he didn't know what he was doing. Every instinct he had told him to give up, go back to his normal life, and pretend that none of this ever happened. But something inside him, some deep, nagging voice, kept whispering that he couldn't stop. Not yet. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the news, half hoping he'd see a headline that confirmed some massive disaster he could prevent. But there was nothing. Just the usual headlines about weather, city council meetings, and the occasional story about rising crime in downtown Chicago. Rising crime. Max's eyes lingered on the words. Could that be something? Later that day, Max found himself wandering the streets of downtown Chicago again, this time more out of frustration than actual purpose. He passed by street vendors, weaving through crowds of tourists and locals, his eyes scanning for anything remotely suspicious. But, like before, nothing popped out at him. He glanced up at a massive billboard, advertising the latest superhero movie. A buff guy in a sleek, armored suit with glowing blue eyes stared down at him. The tagline read, "The hero we deserve." Max snorted. "Yeah, sure," he muttered. "I'm definitely not that." He kept walking, his feet aimlessly carrying him through the streets until he found himself in front of a small diner. The neon sign above the door flickered, casting a dim glow over the sidewalk. Max's stomach grumbled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since his half-hearted breakfast. With a sigh, he pushed open the door and walked inside. The diner was a typical hole-in-the-wall spot, the kind where the waitstaff had probably been working there since the 80s. Max slid into a booth by the window and glanced at the menu, though he wasn't really hungry. A few minutes later, a waitress came by and took his order, just a coffee. As he sat there, staring out the window, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his failure pressing down on him. Was he really cut out for this? Maybe his powers were just too weak, too weird. Who even needed someone who could barely levitate objects or make coats twitch? He wasn't exactly what people expected when they thought of a hero. A soft chime from the door snapped him out of his thoughts. A woman had just walked in, her eyes scanning the room briefly before she made her way to the counter. She was wearing a dark blazer and had her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Something about her caught Max's attention, maybe it was the confident way she moved, or the fact that she looked slightly out of place in such a rundown diner. She sat at the counter, pulled out a notebook, and started scribbling something down. Max's curiosity got the better of him. He watched her for a few more minutes, trying to place where he'd seen her before. Then it hit him. She was Emily Summers, a reporter for the Chicago Gazette. He had seen her face on the news before, usually covering stories about local crime or city events. Max leaned back in his booth, trying not to make it obvious that he was watching her. What would she be doing in a place like this? Emily ordered a cup of coffee and kept writing in her notebook. Every now and then, she glanced at her phone, scrolling through messages or checking something online. Max couldn't shake the feeling that she was here for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it might be tied to the rising crime he'd been reading about earlier. After a few minutes of awkward internal debate, Max decided to do something that would either be very brave or very stupid. He stood up, grabbed his coffee, and walked over to the counter where Emily was sitting. "Hey, aren't you Emily Summers?" he asked, trying to sound casual but feeling every bit out of his depth. Emily looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "Yeah, that's me," she replied, her voice steady but cautious. "Do I know you?" "No, I mean, not really," Max stammered. "I've seen you on the news." "You're a reporter for the Gazette, right?" "That's right." She put her pen down and turned to face him fully. "And you are?" "Max Walker," he said, offering a half-hearted smile. I just thought it was cool seeing you here. I follow some of your stories." Emily raised an eyebrow, clearly not used to being approached in random diners by fans of her work. "Well, thanks, I guess. What brings you to this place?" Max shrugged. "I'm just around. Trying to get a feel for things. There's been a lot of talk about rising crime downtown lately, and I thought, well, I don't know what I thought." Emily gave him a curious look. "You're not with the police, are you?" Max let out a short laugh. No, definitely not. I'm just interested. There was a pause, and Max could feel the awkwardness settling in. He wasn't sure why he had approached her in the first place. What was he going to say? Hey, I've got powers but I have no idea what to do with them, wanna help? Actually, Emily said, breaking the silence, I've been looking into the recent crime wave. You're right, there's definitely been an uptick in robberies and muggings around the city. It's not a coincidence. Max leaned in, suddenly more interested. What do you mean? Emily glanced around the diner before lowering her voice. There's something going on in the city. I've been following a string of crimes, and they all seem connected somehow. Like someone's coordinating them. Max blinked. You think someone's behind it? I know someone is, Emily replied, her eyes intense. The problem is, I don't have proof. Not yet. But I'm working on it. Max felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. This was the first he'd heard of anything like this, and it was exactly the kind of thing he needed to prove himself. But he wasn't exactly equipped to handle coordinated crime rings. Still, this was the first real lead he'd gotten since his powers showed up. Maybe if he stuck around Emily, he'd be able to figure out how to use them properly. A few more minutes passed in silence, Emily occasionally scribbling in her notebook while Max sat awkwardly nearby, nursing his coffee. He wasn't sure what his next move should be. He had come over here on a whim, and now he was stuck. You seem pretty interested in all of this, Emily said suddenly, not looking up from her writing. You sure you're not a cop? Max smiled awkwardly. I'm definitely not a cop. Then why the interest? Emily asked, finally glancing up at him. Max hesitated. How was he supposed to explain this? He couldn't exactly tell her he had superpowers that he barely knew how to control. I guess I've just been feeling like I should do something, you know. Help, somehow. I don't know. Emily studied him for a moment, as if trying to figure him out. You want to help? Max nodded, though his uncertainty must have shown on his face. Well, if you're serious about it, I could use an extra set of eyes. I'm still piecing things together, but I'm getting closer. I just need to be in more places at once. She shrugged. It's not glamorous, but if you really want to help, I'll take it. Max's heart skipped a beat. This was his chance. I'd love to help. Great, Emily said, finishing her coffee and standing up. Meet me tomorrow at the Gazette offices. We'll see if you're up for it. Before Max could respond, she had already slipped a business card into his hand and was heading for the door. Wait, what exactly do you need me to do? Max called after her. Emily smiled slightly. I'll let you know tomorrow. Be ready. As soon as she was gone, Max stared down at the card in his hand, his mind racing. He had come to the diner on a whim, and now he had just gotten himself involved in something much bigger than he'd expected. Emily was smart, way smarter than him, and she was on to something. Something big. But was he really ready for this? Could he handle it? Max looked out the window, watching as the city bustled on outside. He had no idea what he was getting into, but one thing was clear. His days of invisibility were officially over. Chapter 4, Not All Powers Are Useful. Max Walker stared at the business card in his hand. The thin piece of cardstock felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the weight of the decisions he'd made over the last few days. Emily Summers, investigative reporter, had just recruited him, to help her investigate the city's growing crime problem. And she had no idea who he really was. He sat back in his apartment that night, running over the details. His powers, so far, had been less than impressive. Sure, he could levitate small objects and move things around with his mind, but nothing like the superheroes from the movies. The more he tried to use them, the more he realized just how useless they were in actual dangerous situations. If Emily ever found out what he was trying to do, well, she'd probably laugh him out of her office. Still, this was the first real opportunity to get involved in something bigger. Maybe he didn't have super strength or laser vision, but there had to be a way to make his powers work in his favor. Right? The next morning, Max stood outside the offices of the Chicago Gazette, clutching the strap of his messenger bag nervously. The building looked imposing, its stone facade towering over the busy street. People moved around him in a hurry, but Max stood still, feeling like he was on the edge of a cliff. Get it together, Walker. You're already in this. Might as well make it work. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, the newsroom was buzzing. Journalists moved between desks, phones ringing off the hook, papers rustling. The room was alive with the sound of people chasing stories, deadlines looming. Max felt a little out of place as he made his way toward the elevators, but he tried to project confidence, even though every fiber of his being wanted to turn around and leave. When he reached the third floor, the elevator doors slid open to reveal Emily, who was waiting for him in the hallway, her phone in hand. She looked up, flashed him a quick smile, then gestured for him to follow her. Glad you made it. We don't have much time, there's been another incident. Max's heart skipped a beat. Incident, he echoed, following her down the hall. Emily nodded, her expression serious. Another strange disappearance. This time, it's not just random objects going missing. It's bigger. Max followed Emily into a small conference room where she had papers, maps, and notes spread out across the table. He glanced at the clutter, feeling a little overwhelmed. This started small, things disappearing from local shops, personal items from people's homes, random objects from city parks. But now, we've got entire shipments of goods vanishing from warehouses. No trace of them. No signs of break-ins. It's like they just vanished into thin air. Max frowned, trying to process the information. And you think it's all connected? Emily nodded, crossing her arms as she leaned against the table. I do. There's a pattern here, and it's getting worse. I've been mapping out the locations of each disappearance, and they're all concentrated in this area. She pointed to a spot on the map. The Loop. Max leaned over the table, staring at the map. The Loop was one of the busiest areas of the city, filled with businesses, tourists, and commuters. If something, or someone, was behind the disappearances, they were operating right under everyone's noses. But why would someone want to make things disappear? Emily shrugged. Could be for a lot of reasons. Resale on the black market, sabotage, or maybe just for chaos. The bigger question is how they're doing it. No one's seen anything. No security cameras have caught anything unusual. It's like the objects are just gone. Max's mind raced. Could this be related to his powers? He hadn't told Emily the truth about what he could do, but the idea of objects disappearing without a trace seemed eerily similar to what he'd been experiencing. That night, Max lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. His powers weren't just weird, there was something wrong with them. He'd been able to move objects, sure, but he'd also felt that strange energy, that pull. What if the disappearances around the city were somehow connected to that? What if there were others out there with powers like his? He wasn't sure what to do. Should he tell Emily? Would she even believe him? He barely believed it himself. The idea that his powers might be tied to something bigger was terrifying and exciting all at once. But if he was going to figure this out, he needed to understand what was really going on. The next day, Max and Emily found themselves walking through the bustling streets of the Loop, trying to get a better sense of the pattern. Emily was deep in thought, her brow furrowed as she scanned the area. Max followed her lead, though his mind was elsewhere, still fixated on the strange connection between his powers and the disappearances. None of this makes sense. Whoever's doing this must have access to some serious tech, but even then, how could they pull off something like this without leaving any trace? Max glanced at her, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He wanted to tell her, needed to tell her. But how? Before he could say anything, Emily's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting to one of urgency. Another one. Warehouse by the river. Let's go. They arrived at the scene, where police tape cordoned off the entrance to a large, empty warehouse. Officers milled about, talking to workers who were shaking their heads in confusion. Max and Emily stood just outside the perimeter, watching. Emily turned to Max, her eyes sharp. I need to get in there and ask some questions. Wait here. I'll see what I can find out. Max nodded as she walked over to one of the officers, flashing her press badge. As Emily disappeared into the building, Max's stomach twisted. What if he was right? What if this had something to do with him? He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something, anything, to help. But what? He wasn't exactly a detective, and his powers were more of a hindrance than a help. Still, he couldn't stand around doing nothing. Max moved away from the crowd, ducking behind a stack of crates near the back of the warehouse. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then closed his eyes, focusing on that strange energy inside him. Okay, let's see if you can actually do something useful for once. He reached out mentally, trying to sense the objects inside the warehouse. It was like stretching a muscle he didn't quite know how to use, but slowly, he felt the familiar tingle of his powers. He focused harder, trying to push past the awkwardness of it. Suddenly, he felt a pull, something on the other side of the building. Max's eyes snapped open. He couldn't explain it, but he knew there was something there. Without thinking, he slipped inside the warehouse through a side entrance, moving as quietly as he could. The warehouse was vast and empty, except for a few scattered boxes and pallets. Max made his way through the shadows, following the strange pull of his powers. It was like a beacon, guiding him toward something he couldn't see. As he rounded a corner, he stopped short. There, hidden behind a stack of crates, was a small metallic device. It was sleek, with glowing blue lights and a faint hum emanating from it. Max's heart raced. This was it, this was what had been causing the disappearances. He crouched down, reaching out to touch the device, but the moment his fingers brushed against it, a jolt of energy shot through him. Max stumbled back, gasping as the device pulsed, sending a shockwave through the warehouse. The lights flickered, and for a split second, Max saw something, a figure, blurry and indistinct, standing in the shadows. Before he could react, the figure disappeared, leaving Max alone with the strange device. By the time Emily found him, Max was still trying to process what had just happened. She looked at him, eyes wide with concern. Max, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. Max shook his head, still dazed. I think I found something. But it's gone now. Emily frowned, her eyes darting to the empty space where the device had been. Gone. What do you mean, gone? Max hesitated. I think, someone's behind this. And whatever they're using, it's not normal. Emily stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Max thought she was going to call him crazy, but instead, she nodded slowly. Looks like we're in deeper than I thought. That night, Max lay awake again, the events of the day replaying in his mind. Whoever, or whatever, was behind the disappearances wasn't just some petty criminal. This was something much bigger, and Max had a sinking feeling that his powers were somehow connected to it. But for the first time, he wasn't just scared. He was determined. If this was his fight, then he was going to figure it out, no matter how useless his powers seemed. And maybe, just maybe, he'd prove that not all heroes needed to be perfect. Chapter 5, The Mystery Deepens. Max Walker sat in his small apartment, staring at the crumpled notes scattered across his coffee table. The events of the past few days had thrown his life into chaos, but it wasn't just the weird crimes, the missing objects, or the strange device he had found in the warehouse that weighed on his mind. It was his own growing sense of unease. His powers, if they could even be called that, weren't helping. Instead, they seemed to make things worse. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his messages. There were a few from Ben, his sarcastic best friend, asking how his hero gig was going, but Max didn't have the energy to respond. There was also a message from Emily, sent earlier that morning. Emily. Meet me at the Gazette at noon. I think I found something. Max tossed the phone onto the couch and sighed. Emily was determined, no doubt about that. She had a lead, some clue she was following, and Max had been tagging along, trying to be useful. But the truth was, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the charade. Every time he tried to use his powers, something went wrong. How could he help if his abilities only made things more complicated? Max leaned back on the couch and closed his eyes, trying to calm the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. He wasn't sure what Emily had found, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more dangerous. When Max arrived at the Chicago Gazette later that day, the newsroom was buzzing with activity. Reporters hurried from desk to desk, phones rang off the hook, and the clatter of keyboards filled the air. Max made his way through the chaos until he spotted Emily sitting at a table near the back, a stack of papers in front of her. She looked up as he approached and gave him a small smile. Glad you're here. We've got a lot to go over. Max slid into the seat across from her, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. So, what did you find? Emily handed him a few of the papers. Take a look at this. Max scanned the pages, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of the information. It was a list of recent thefts, but they weren't the usual kinds of crimes you'd expect to see in a city. No money had been stolen, no valuable electronics. Instead, random objects were disappearing, construction equipment, crates of metal parts, electronics components. Things that, on their own, didn't seem like much, but together could be used to build something. I've been tracking these thefts for weeks, and they're getting more frequent. Whoever's behind this, they're not just taking random things. They're gathering materials, maybe for a weapon, maybe for something else. I'm not sure yet. But what's clear is that they have a plan. Max felt a chill run down his spine. The more Emily talked, the more it became obvious that something big was happening. Something dangerous. And he was in the middle of it, whether he liked it or not. So what do we do? I mean, it's not like we can just walk up to the police and tell them someone's building, whatever this is. Emily nodded, her expression serious. We're not going to the police. Not yet. I've tried to get them involved before, but they won't take it seriously without hard evidence. Right now, it's just a bunch of missing inventory to them. Max felt the weight of his growing doubt pressing down on him. But what can we do? We don't even know who's behind this. Emily leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. That's what we're going to find out. I've managed to track the thefts to a few specific locations, warehouses, storage facilities. There's a pattern here, and I think I know where they're going to hit next. Later that night, Max found himself standing in the shadows outside a nondescript warehouse on the edge of the city. The air was crisp, and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the pavement. Emily stood beside him, her expression focused and determined. This place has been on my radar for a while. A lot of strange activity here, late-night shipments, deliveries that don't match the official records. If I'm right, whoever's behind these thefts will make a move tonight. Max swallowed hard, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He wasn't cut out for this. He wasn't a detective, and he definitely wasn't a hero. He was just Max Walker, the guy who could barely control his powers. What if something goes wrong? I mean, I'm not exactly equipped to handle whatever this is. Emily glanced at him, her eyes sharp. We'll figure it out. I know you're not a cop, Max, but you're here because you care. That counts for something. Max wasn't sure if that was true, but he nodded anyway. He wasn't about to bail on Emily now, not when they were this close to figuring out what was happening. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. They waited in silence, hidden behind a stack of crates near the entrance to the warehouse. Time seemed to stretch out, each passing minute making Max more uneasy. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if they were caught? What if the people behind this had weapons? What if his powers failed him again? Suddenly, a faint noise broke the silence. Max froze, his heart pounding. Emily tensed beside him, her eyes darting toward the warehouse door. It slid open slowly, and two figures emerged from the shadows, moving quickly and quietly as they loaded crates into the back of a truck. Emily nudged Max, her voice barely a whisper. This is it. Max swallowed hard, his hands shaking. He focused on the two figures, trying to stay calm. This was his chance to do something, to help. But as he watched them move, he felt the familiar doubt creeping in. Could he really stop them? Or would he just make things worse? What do we do now? Emily's eyes were locked on the truck. We follow them. See where they're taking the crates. Then we call for backup. Max nodded, his pulse racing. Following the truck seemed like the safest option. At least they wouldn't be confronting the thieves directly. But even as they moved silently toward Emily's car, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. The truck rumbled through the empty streets, its taillights glowing dimly in the distance. Emily kept a safe distance as they followed, her hands steady on the wheel. Max sat in the passenger seat, his nerves fraying with every passing second. Do you think they know we're following them? Emily shook her head. Not yet. Just stay calm. We're almost there. But Max couldn't stay calm. His mind was a blur of worst-case scenarios. What if they were leading them into a trap? What if they had backup waiting at the destination? And more than anything, Max worried about what he would do if things went sideways. He still hadn't told Emily the truth about his powers. He wasn't sure how she'd react, or if she'd even believe him. As the truck made a sharp turn into an abandoned industrial park, Emily slowed the car and parked a few blocks away, out of sight. They slipped out of the car and crept toward the entrance, keeping low as they approached the perimeter of the lot. The truck had pulled up to a large, dilapidated building, and the figures were unloading the crates into the structure. Max could hear the faint sounds of machinery coming from inside. Something was happening in there, something big. They've been using places like this all over the city. It's where they're storing everything they steal. But I still don't know why. Max glanced at the building, his heart pounding in his chest. What now? Emily pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. I'm calling for backup. Stay here and keep an eye on them. Max's stomach churned as Emily slipped back toward the car, leaving him alone. He crouched behind a rusted metal container, trying to keep calm. But the longer he waited, the more his nerves got the best of him. His mind raced, he could sense the pull of his powers, that strange energy that always seemed to hum just beneath the surface, but he wasn't sure what to do with it. And then, without warning, one of the figures glanced in his direction. Max's heart stopped. The figure took a step forward, squinting into the shadows. Max held his breath, praying he wouldn't be seen. But as the figure moved closer, Max realized he had no choice. He had to act. With a surge of panic, Max reached out with his mind, focusing on the metal container in front of him. It was heavier than anything he'd moved before, but he didn't have time to think about that now. He clenched his fists, his hands shaking as he willed the container to shift, just enough to create a distraction. At first, nothing happened. The figure kept moving toward him, and Max could feel the sweat beading on his forehead. He tried again, harder this time, and finally, the container shifted with a loud scrape. The figure stopped, his head snapping toward the sound. For a moment, Max thought he'd been caught, but then the man turned and jogged back toward the truck, shouting something to his partner. Max exhaled shakily, his heart racing. He bought himself some time, but he knew it wouldn't last. Moments later, Emily returned, her expression tense. Backup's on the way, but we need to move, now. Max nodded, still rattled from the close call. Together, they slipped away from the industrial park, retreating to the safety of the car. As they drove away, the weight of the night's events settled over them. Back at Emily's office, Max sat in silence, his mind still reeling. They had managed to gather enough evidence to link the thefts to the strange industrial sites, but there were still too many unanswered questions. What were the thieves building? Who was behind it all? Emily paced the room, her frustration palpable. We're close, Max. I can feel it. But there's still something missing. Max stared at the map on the wall, his thoughts heavy. He knew she was right, they were close. But as the pieces of the puzzle started to come together, Max couldn't shake the feeling that his role in all of this was becoming more complicated. Because whatever was happening in the city, his powers were tied to it. And that terrified him more than anything. Chapter 6, A Hero's Costume Can't Save You. Max Walker stood in front of the mirror, holding up an old hoodie, a ski mask, and a pair of fingerless gloves. He stared at his reflection, feeling ridiculous. It was supposed to be his hero costume, a way to step out of the shadows and take action, but now he wasn't so sure. Okay, this is dumb. He tossed the hoodie on the bathroom counter and rubbed his face in frustration. The whole idea of becoming a hero had seemed so exciting at first, an escape from his ordinary life. But every time he tried to use his powers, it felt like a joke. His weird telekinetic abilities had more or less led to embarrassing disasters, and despite his best intentions, he wasn't any closer to stopping the crimes happening in the city. But after everything he and Emily had uncovered at the warehouse, the strange disappearances, the stolen equipment, and the ominous device, Max couldn't just walk away. He had powers, no matter how awkward or unreliable, and maybe they could still be useful. He just needed a new plan. One that wouldn't make him look like a fool. Alright, time to stop messing around. The next morning, Max walked into Gus's diner, a place he and Ben often met for breakfast. Ben was already seated in their usual booth, sipping coffee and playing with his phone. When Max slid into the booth across from him, Ben gave him an amused look. "So, how's the superhero life? Stopped any crimes yet, or are you still perfecting your costume?" Max glared at him. "Very funny. Actually, I'm working on a plan." Ben raised an eyebrow and set down his coffee. "A plan? Dude, the last time you tried to help someone, you covered an old lady in milk. This should be good." Max rolled his eyes, ignoring the jibe. "That was a mistake. This time it's different. I'm not just messing around, I've got real info. Emily and I have been tracking these strange crimes across the city, and I think I know where they're going to strike next." Ben stared at Max for a moment, then burst into laughter. You think you're gonna stop some criminal mastermind with your powers? You can barely levitate a coffee cup. Laugh all you want. I'm serious. Something big is happening in this city, and I'm not going to sit around and do nothing. Ben stopped laughing and studied Max's face. "You're actually serious, aren't you? Dude, come on. You don't have the kind of powers that'll stop criminals. What are you going to do? Make their hats fly off?" Max leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't know yet, but I'm not giving up. I have to try." Later that afternoon, Max was back in his apartment, his laptop open in front of him. He was done waiting for things to happen. He needed to be proactive, and that started with surveillance. Max pulled up the map Emily had sent him, filled with red pins marking the locations of the recent thefts. The pattern was clear: whoever was behind the disappearances was moving systematically through the city, hitting warehouses and storage facilities. Emily had predicted the next possible target, and if she was right, they'd make their move soon. This is it. My chance to actually do something. He quickly scribbled down notes and packed his bag, making sure to include his hoodie and gloves. He wasn't thrilled about the outfit, but if he was going to be sneaking around, he figured he should at least try to look the part. After a quick glance in the mirror, he grabbed his things and headed out. Max arrived at the warehouse district just as the sun was setting. The streets were quiet, with only the occasional passing car breaking the stillness. He found a good spot behind a stack of crates where he could watch the warehouse Emily had marked as the next target. His heart raced as he crouched in the shadows, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Hours passed. Max's legs started to cramp, and his nerves were fraying. He wasn't used to this. His mind kept replaying every mistake he'd made over the past week: the grocery fiasco, the botched alley confrontation. What if this was just another one of those failures? What if nothing happened at all? But then, as if on cue, he heard the rumble of a truck approaching. Max's pulse quickened. He peeked out from behind the crates and saw two men get out of the truck, moving toward the warehouse with purpose. Here we go. He watched as the men began loading crates from the truck into the warehouse, working quickly and quietly. Max's mind raced. He could try to stop them, but how? His powers were unreliable, and the last thing he wanted was to cause another disaster. But he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. Taking a deep breath, Max closed his eyes and focused. He could feel the familiar tingle of his powers, that strange energy he could never quite control. If he could just distract them long enough, maybe he could figure out what they were doing. Max reached out with his mind, focusing on a pile of metal pipes stacked near the truck. With a surge of effort, he willed them to move. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the pipes began to shift. One by one, they started rolling toward the truck, clattering loudly against the pavement. The men looked up, startled. What the hell was that? Max ducked back behind the crates, his heart pounding. He had done it, he'd created a distraction. Now he just had to stay out of sight and... Suddenly, the men started shouting again, but this time, it wasn't just about the pipes. One of them had spotted something, a security camera mounted on the side of the warehouse. We've been spotted. Let's get out of here. Max's stomach dropped as he realized what was happening. The men were scrambling to get back in the truck, abandoning their cargo. His distraction had worked, but in the worst possible way. Now they were leaving, and Max had no way to stop them. Without thinking, Max stepped out from behind the crates and tried to use his powers again. He focused on the truck's rear tires, willing them to lift off the ground, hoping to stall the getaway. But instead of stopping the truck, his powers misfired. One of the crates near the truck exploded, sending boxes flying in every direction. The men looked back in confusion but didn't stop. The truck roared to life, speeding away from the scene, leaving a trail of chaos behind. Damn it! He stood there in the empty lot, surrounded by the aftermath of his failed attempt. The warehouse doors were wide open, the stolen crates scattered everywhere, and the truck was long gone. Max had tried to be a hero, but once again, he'd only made things worse. The next day, Max sat in Emily's office, staring down at his hands as she paced the room, her frustration palpable. I don't understand. We had everything lined up. We knew where they'd hit next, and now they're gone. What happened? Max felt the weight of guilt pressing down on him. He hadn't told Emily about his powers yet, and after last night's fiasco, he wasn't sure he ever would. How could he explain that he had been the one who messed everything up? I'm sorry. I was there. I tried to stop them, but... I guess I wasn't fast enough. Emily stopped pacing and looked at him, her expression softening slightly. It's not your fault, Max. We'll get another chance. But we need to be more prepared next time. Max nodded, but inside, he felt like a fraud. Emily had no idea what really happened, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending that he was something he wasn't. As he left the Gazette that afternoon, Max couldn't shake the feeling that he was in way over his head. The city was facing a real threat, and he wasn't even close to being the hero it needed. His costume couldn't save him from his own self-doubt. And for the first time, Max wondered if he ever would be able to save anyone at all. Chapter 7, When Villains Are Just as Clumsy. Max Walker sat at the edge of his bed, staring down at his hands, trying to make sense of what had happened over the past few weeks. He had done everything he could to be a hero, to use his powers for good, but no matter how hard he tried, it always ended in disaster. Every plan, every attempt to help had blown up in his face. Now, more than ever, he felt the weight of his inadequacy. He had powers, useless, clumsy powers, but it seemed like no matter what he did, they only caused more trouble. After the mess at the warehouse, he wasn't even sure if he should keep trying. Emily still believed in him, but that belief felt misplaced. Max didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a joke. And then there was the villain. Or at least, that's what Max assumed the guy was. The thought made him want to laugh. He had seen the mysterious figure during the latest heist, a man in a cheap, ill-fitting black jumpsuit, skulking around the warehouse. His movements were erratic, like he didn't quite know what he was doing either. But what stuck with Max the most was how utterly ridiculous the guy had looked. Who dresses like that? A bad Halloween costume? This so-called villain had somehow gotten away with the stolen goods, though not without stumbling into things, tripping over his own feet, and generally looking more like a clumsy fool than a mastermind criminal. And now Max couldn't shake the strange feeling that, for the first time, he had met someone as out of place as he was. Maybe this villain was just as bad at being a criminal as Max was at being a hero. Max shook his head and stood up. His powers might be a mess, but if he was going to keep going, he needed to confront this guy. If nothing else, he could finally understand who or what he was up against. Max sat across from Emily the next day at the Chicago Gazette, tapping his fingers nervously on the table. She was in full-on investigative mode, typing furiously on her laptop, surrounded by papers and notes. After the failed warehouse surveillance, things had only gotten more confusing, and Emily was determined to figure it all out. "I've been digging deeper into these thefts, and I think we've missed something. This isn't just about stealing equipment. There's a pattern. Max, whoever's behind this is targeting specific places, and I think they're building something. We just don't know what yet." Max nodded absent-mindedly, still thinking about the clumsy figure from the warehouse. "You're awfully quiet today. Something on your mind?" Max hesitated. He hadn't told her about seeing the bumbling villain during the heist. How could he explain what he had seen without sounding ridiculous? "I just saw someone at the warehouse. A guy. I think he was involved in the theft." Emily's eyes lit up with interest. "What? Why didn't you say something earlier? What did he look like?" Max scratched the back of his neck, feeling awkward. "Well, he was in this weird black jumpsuit. It looked cheap, like something you'd get at a Halloween store. And he was clumsy. Like, really clumsy." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Clumsy? What do you mean?" "He kept tripping over things, knocking stuff over. Honestly, he looked like he had no idea what he was doing." Emily stared at him, processing the information. "You're telling me that the guy behind all these crimes, the one we've been chasing, is some clumsy idiot in a cheap costume?" Max shrugged. "I mean, that's what it looked like. But I don't know, maybe he's more dangerous than he seems." Emily sighed and leaned back in her chair, clearly frustrated. "Great. We're dealing with a buffoon who somehow keeps pulling off these heists." Max couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and confusion. The idea of going up against someone who was as inept as he was both comforting and unsettling. On one hand, it meant he wasn't alone in his awkwardness. On the other, it made the situation feel even more absurd. A few days later, Max found himself patrolling the streets near one of the suspected theft locations. He had thrown on his usual hero outfit, the same hoodie and mask combo he had worn during his previous misadventures. It wasn't a real costume, but it was the best he had for now. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he had to do something. Emily had pinpointed a few warehouses that might be targeted next, and Max was determined to stop the villain this time. If nothing else, he needed to prove to himself that he wasn't totally useless. Max crouched behind a parked car, watching as the sun set and the streets grew quieter. The warehouse district was always a little eerie at night, with its abandoned lots and dimly lit streets. Max's nerves were on edge as he scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement. And then he saw him. The clumsy villain, dressed in the same ridiculous black jumpsuit, was creeping toward the entrance of the warehouse. Max watched in disbelief as the man tripped over a loose brick, nearly falling face-first onto the pavement. The guy was a walking disaster. Unbelievable. For a moment, Max didn't know whether to laugh or feel sorry for the guy. But then, remembering why he was there, he steeled himself. This was his chance. He wasn't going to let this clown get away again. Max stood up, took a deep breath, and stepped out from behind the car. Hey! Stop right there. The villain froze, clearly startled by Max's sudden appearance. He turned around slowly, his movements stiff and awkward. Max could see the guy's eyes widen behind the cheap mask. You're not supposed to be here. Max took a step forward, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Neither are you. The villain shifted nervously, glancing around like he was looking for an escape route. But there wasn't anywhere for him to run. Max could feel his powers stirring, the familiar tingling sensation in his fingertips. This was it. He was going to stop this guy. Whatever you're planning, it ends here. I'm not going to let you get away with it. The villain looked genuinely panicked. Look, I don't want any trouble, okay? I'm just doing my job. Max blinked, caught off guard. Your job? What kind of job is stealing from warehouses? The villain rubbed the back of his neck, looking embarrassed. I'm not really a villain, okay? This whole thing is, I don't know, a gig. I got hired to help move some stuff, that's all. Max stared at him, trying to process what he was hearing. This guy wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was just a guy. You got hired to dress up like that and steal from warehouses? The villain shrugged. Pretty much. I mean, the pay's decent, and I didn't think I'd actually get caught. Max didn't know whether to laugh or scream. This was the guy he had been so worried about. A bumbling goof who had taken a job as a low-level crook. Before Max could respond, the villain suddenly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, one that looked eerily similar to the one Max had seen at the warehouse with Emily. The villain fumbled with it for a moment, clearly not entirely sure how to use it. Don't make me use this. I don't even know what it does, but it's probably dangerous. Max's eyes widened. Wait, don't. But it was too late. The villain pressed the button, and the device whirred to life, sending a pulse of energy through the air. Max felt the ground shift beneath his feet, and before he knew it, he was thrown backward, crashing into a stack of crates. Okay, that hurt. The villain, equally surprised by the device's power, stood frozen for a moment before making a run for it. Max struggled to get to his feet, his head spinning from the blast. He couldn't let the guy get away, not again. Max stumbled out of the alley, still dazed from the energy pulse. He could see the villain up ahead, tripping over his own feet as he tried to make his escape. Max's powers surged, and with a burst of effort, he sent a nearby trash can flying toward the villain. It wasn't exactly a graceful move, but the can collided with the guy's legs, knocking him to the ground. Max jogged over, still wincing from the impact of the blast. The villain groaned, struggling to push the trash can off of him. Man, I knew I should have stuck to pizza delivery. Max couldn't help but laugh. Maybe next time you'll think twice before taking a job as a criminal. The villain sighed, clearly too exhausted to argue. Yeah, you're probably right. Later that night, as Max sat on his couch, nursing a few bruises from the encounter, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. He had finally stopped the guy, even if the whole thing had been ridiculous. The villain wasn't some evil mastermind, but at least Max had done something right for once. As he sipped his coffee, Max's phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. Emily. Heard about what happened. Nice work. Maybe you're not as hopeless as you think. Max smiled to himself, feeling a bit more confident than he had in days. Maybe he wasn't the perfect hero, but he was starting to get the hang of it. One bumbling villain at a time. Chapter 8, A Date with Disaster. Max Walker had decided to take a break from his increasingly chaotic superhero life. After weeks of failed heroics, awkward encounters with villains, and botched attempts to use his powers, he was ready for something normal. Something that didn't involve explosions, stolen goods, or him tripping over his own feet while trying to stop a crime. And, most of all, he wanted to get closer to Emily. He wasn't sure when it had happened exactly, but at some point during their investigations, Max had started seeing Emily in a different light. She was sharp, determined, and far more competent than he was at pretty much everything. But she was also kind, funny, and had a way of making him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a complete failure at this whole hero thing. He admired her. Okay, Max. You've faced criminals, survived energy blasts, and somehow managed to get through it all. Asking Emily to hang out shouldn't be harder than that, right? He took a deep breath and glanced at his phone. He had typed out a message to Emily at least 6 times, but every time, his finger hovered over the send button, paralyzed by indecision. What if she thought he was weird? Or worse, what if she just didn't see him that way? Come on, man. It's not like you're asking her to marry you. Finally, after much internal struggle, Max hit send. Hey, Emily. Thought maybe we could grab a coffee and talk about the latest leads. What do you think? His stomach did a little flip as he stared at the screen, waiting for her reply. Seconds felt like hours. Then, his phone buzzed. Emily. Sounds good. I know a great place. Meet you tomorrow at 5. Max let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. She said yes. The next day, Max found himself standing outside the Bean Roaster, a cozy little coffee shop tucked away on a quiet street in Chicago's River North neighborhood. It was a far cry from the hectic warehouse districts and crime scenes he was used to these days. He had even managed to dress like a normal person for once, no hoodies or gloves, just a button-down shirt and jeans. A step up, he thought. Emily arrived a few minutes later, looking effortlessly put together as always. She smiled when she saw him, and Max's nerves instantly kicked back into high gear. Hey, Max. You beat me here. Yeah, thought I'd try being early for once. Doesn't happen often. They grabbed a table by the window, and for the first few minutes, things were, surprisingly normal. They talked about work, shared a few jokes, and even made fun of the latest ridiculous headline from one of Chicago's tabloids. Max was beginning to relax. So, no villains or explosions today. It's almost like you're turning into a regular person. Max laughed, though inside he felt a little twinge of guilt. He still hadn't told Emily the full truth about his powers or the fact that his heroics were largely accidental and often disastrous. But for now, he was just enjoying the normalcy. I'm trying to keep the chaos to a minimum. I figured you deserve at least one day where nothing goes wrong. You're setting the bar pretty high. I'm not sure if nothing goes wrong is in your vocabulary. Max opened his mouth to respond when, out of nowhere, a loud crash echoed from the street outside. His heart sank. Of course. The universe wasn't going to let him have one normal afternoon. Emily's head snapped toward the window. What was that? Max stood up, peeking out the window. Across the street, a group of people were running in panic, and in the distance, he saw something that made his stomach drop, a black van speeding down the road, swerving recklessly as it dodged cars and pedestrians. The van's back doors were flung open, and Max could see boxes and equipment tumbling out. You've got to be kidding me. Looks like our date's been cut short. Max followed her out of the coffee shop, his mind racing. He didn't know who was behind the wheel of that van, but it had all the signs of another one of the city's strange crimes. And, of course, it had to happen right when things were finally going well with Emily. They sprinted down the sidewalk, trying to catch up with the van. It skidded around a corner, narrowly missing a parked car. "We need to stop them before someone gets hurt." Max's heart raced. He could feel his powers stirring, that familiar tingle in his fingertips. He had to do something. This was his chance to actually be useful for once. But he wasn't exactly sure how to pull it off without making a fool of himself. As they rounded the corner, Max spotted the van stopped at a red light, its engine revving impatiently. This was his moment. He focused on the van's rear tires, trying to lift them just enough to keep the vehicle from moving. He stretched out his hand, concentrating. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the van's back end started to rise off the ground, just a few inches. Max could feel the strain, his powers barely under control, but he was doing it. The van was stuck. Whoa, how is that happening? Max swallowed hard, his concentration slipping. I don't know. Must be a weird angle or something. Just then, the light turned green, and the van's driver slammed on the gas. Max's grip faltered, and the van shot forward, its tires screeching as it sped away. He winced as it disappeared down the road, out of reach. Great. So much for that plan. Emily shot him a curious look, but before she could say anything, they heard a loud crash from the next street over. Another stolen vehicle, a delivery truck this time, had plowed into a fire hydrant, sending water spraying into the air. "We've got to catch up with them." By the time they made it to the scene of the crash, the driver had already abandoned the truck and was running down the sidewalk. Emily immediately gave chase, with Max struggling to keep up. Why does this always happen when I'm with her? As they chased the driver through a busy shopping district, Max tried to think of a way to stop the guy without causing more chaos. His powers weren't exactly reliable, but he had to try something. The thief darted into a small alley, and Max saw his chance. With a burst of focus, he reached out with his mind, grabbing hold of a stack of trash cans near the alley entrance. He sent them flying into the thief's path, blocking his escape. The man stumbled, tripping over the cans and crashing to the ground. "Nice move." Max grinned, feeling a surge of confidence. Maybe I'm getting the hang of this after all. But just as they reached the alley, Max's powers fizzled out, and the trash cans he had thrown began to roll back toward him, right into his legs. He yelped in surprise as he was knocked off his feet, landing flat on his back in the alley. Never mind. Still a work in progress. Emily ran over to help him up, barely containing her laughter. "You've got a real talent for making things harder than they need to be." Max winced as he got to his feet, brushing dirt off his shirt. "Yeah, it's kind of my thing." Despite the chaos, the thief was still on the ground, groaning in pain, and Max couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. They had stopped him, even if it wasn't exactly graceful. Later that evening, Max and Emily sat on a park bench, catching their breath after the chase. The stolen goods had been returned, and the police had taken the thief into custody, but Max's mind was still racing from the day's events. "Well, that wasn't the relaxing coffee date I had in mind, but at least we got the bad guy." Max chuckled, though part of him still felt embarrassed. "Yeah, sorry about that. I swear, every time I'm around you, things just go wrong." Emily shook her head, her smile softening. "Don't apologize, Max. It wasn't your fault. Besides, you actually helped today. You stopped that guy." Max blinked, surprised by her words. "Yeah, I guess I did." Emily leaned back, gazing at the city lights in the distance. You know, I've been chasing stories like this for a long time, but today felt different. It's not every day I get to chase down bad guys with someone who can do what you do. Max froze, his heart skipping a beat. Did she know? Had she figured out his secret? What do you mean? Emily glanced at him, her eyes twinkling. I'm not stupid, Max. I've seen some weird things happen when you're around. I don't know how, but you've got something that most people don't. Max stared at her, unsure of what to say. She knew. She had figured it out. He wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. Yeah. I guess I do. Emily reached over and placed a hand on his arm. Don't worry. Your secret's safe with me. And for what it's worth, I think you're doing a lot better than you give yourself credit for. Max smiled, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a total screw-up. Maybe, just maybe, he could make this hero thing work after all. Thanks, Emily. That means a lot. She smiled back, and for a moment, everything felt right. No disasters, no villains, just the two of them, sitting together under the Chicago night sky. But deep down, Max knew that disaster had a funny way of showing up when you least expected it. Chapter 9, The Rising Threat. Max Walker had always viewed his powers as more of a nuisance than a gift. Sure, he could move objects, but every time he tried, chaos followed. However, recent events had been stirring something in him, an unsettling feeling that maybe his powers were more than just clumsy tricks. And with everything that had been happening in the city, the rising thefts, the mysterious equipment being stolen, Max couldn't shake the sense that things were about to get much worse. The latest string of crimes felt different. They weren't just random acts of theft, there was a larger plan at play, and for the first time, Max was starting to believe he had a part in it, whether he liked it or not. Max paced in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the van chase the day before. Everything had seemed almost normal with Emily until that moment, and then, just like always, chaos had erupted. They had stopped a criminal, sure, but barely. Max had fumbled through it, using his powers in ways he hadn't quite controlled. And yet, Emily had hinted she knew something. She wasn't stupid. She had seen the strange things happening when he was around. She knows. She must know by now. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was Emily. Emily. Max, I've got something. Meet me at the Gazette. This is big. Max didn't waste time. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, his mind racing. Whatever Emily had found, it sounded serious. His stomach churned with both dread and anticipation. What could it be this time? He had a feeling this was going to be more dangerous than anything they had dealt with before. When Max arrived at the Chicago Gazette, Emily was already in the small conference room, her face a mix of excitement and worry. The room was cluttered with papers, maps, and a whiteboard full of scribbled notes and photos. She waved him over, and Max immediately felt the intensity in the air. Max, I've connected the dots. Max sat down, glancing at the table full of papers. What did you find? Emily grabbed a stack of documents and handed them to him. All the stolen equipment. The electronics, the construction materials, the high-tech components, they're not random. Whoever's behind this is building something. Max's brow furrowed as he looked through the papers. There were lists of stolen goods, maps showing the locations of the thefts, and reports from other cities. But what are they building? Emily leaned in, her eyes sharp with intensity. That's the scary part. I think they're building a weapon. Max's heart skipped a beat. A weapon? Emily nodded, her expression grim. I've seen this pattern before in other cases. They're collecting the parts they need to construct something big. I'm not sure exactly what it is yet, but based on the materials, it's military-grade tech. This isn't just about petty theft anymore. Max felt a cold chill run down his spine. This was much worse than he'd thought. The idea that someone in the city was building a weapon with stolen tech was terrifying. He had known things were escalating, but this was on a whole new level. So what do we do? Emily stood up and began pacing, her mind clearly racing with plans. I've tracked the likely location of their next heist. There's a high-security facility just outside the city that stores classified military equipment. If I'm right, they're going to hit it next. We need to be there. Max nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. All right. Let's go. The facility Emily had pinpointed was in a desolate industrial area, surrounded by tall fences and heavy security. Max and Emily parked a few blocks away and made their way on foot, staying low as they approached the site. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound being the distant hum of power lines overhead. As they crouched behind a row of shipping containers, Emily checked her watch. If they're going to hit this place, it'll be soon. We need to stay hidden and wait for them to make a move. Max nodded, trying to calm his racing thoughts. His powers hummed beneath the surface, an ever-present reminder that he might need them at any moment. But could he rely on them? Every time he had tried, things had gone sideways. He didn't want to screw this up, especially not with Emily depending on him. They didn't have to wait long. A few minutes later, the sound of an approaching truck broke the silence. Max tensed, peeking around the corner of the containers. Sure enough, a large van was pulling up to the back entrance of the facility. Four men, all dressed in black, climbed out of the van and began unloading crates of equipment. That's them. They've got to be the ones behind this. Max swallowed hard, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline. So, what's the plan? Emily's eyes scanned the area, her mind working quickly. We need to get closer, see what they're taking. But we can't get caught. Stay low and follow me. They crept along the edge of the containers, moving closer to the van. Max could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The men were moving quickly, clearly experienced at this kind of operation. Max's nerves were on edge. If they were caught, it wouldn't just be an awkward encounter. It could get dangerous. As they reached the back of the facility, Emily motioned for Max to stop. They crouched behind a stack of pallets, just a few yards from the thieves. Max watched as the men opened the crates, revealing sleek, high-tech components inside, military-grade equipment. They really are building something. Emily nodded, her eyes narrowing. This is worse than I thought. We need to. Before she could finish, one of the men turned suddenly, his eyes sweeping the area. Max's heart leapt into his throat. Did they see us? Emily grabbed his arm and pulled him further behind the pallets. Stay quiet. The man's gaze lingered on their hiding spot for a moment, but then he turned back to the crates, oblivious to their presence. Max let out a quiet sigh of relief, but his hands were shaking. This was too close. As the men continued loading the equipment into their van, Max felt the familiar tingling in his fingertips. His powers were buzzing, restless. He wanted to do something, anything, to stop them. But he knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, and they'd be in serious trouble. Suddenly, one of the men pulled out a small device, similar to the ones Max had seen at previous thefts. It emitted a faint blue glow, and as the man activated it, Max felt a strange pull, like the air around him was charged with energy. What is that? Max didn't know, but his powers reacted instantly. The tingling in his fingers intensified, almost painful now, as if the device was amplifying the strange energy inside him. He clenched his fists, trying to control it, but it felt like his powers were slipping out of his grasp. I don't know what's happening. Before he could stop it, a wave of energy surged through him, and suddenly, the crates the men were loading into the van began to tremble. One of the crates shot into the air, flipping over and crashing to the ground with a loud bang. The men turned, eyes wide in confusion. What the hell was that? Max's heart raced. He hadn't meant to do that. His powers were out of control, and now they were exposed. Emily grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. We've got to go. Now. They bolted from their hiding spot, running as fast as they could back toward the perimeter of the facility. Behind them, the thieves shouted, their voices growing angrier as they realized they weren't alone. I didn't mean to, I didn't know. It doesn't matter. We need to get out of here. They ran through the industrial park, dodging between buildings and containers as they tried to lose the men chasing them. Max's heart pounded in his ears, and his legs burned from the effort. He could hear the sound of heavy footsteps behind them, getting closer. Suddenly, a shot rang out, a warning shot, thankfully, but still far too close for comfort. Max's powers flared again, and without thinking, he reached out with his mind, grabbing hold of a pile of metal pipes stacked nearby. With a burst of effort, he sent the pipes tumbling into the path of their pursuers, creating a makeshift barrier. The men shouted in frustration as they tripped over the pipes, giving Max and Emily the chance to escape. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of their car, both of them breathless and shaken. Max collapsed against the door, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. What the hell was that? My powers, they just... Emily leaned against the car, equally winded but still focused. That device. Whatever they're using, it's affecting you. It's connected to your powers somehow. Max stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. You think my powers are connected to all of this? To what they're building? Emily nodded, her expression grim. I don't think it's a coincidence. Whatever they're building, your powers are reacting to it. And that means we need to figure this out, fast. Max leaned back, his mind racing. His powers, the thefts, the devices, it was all connected. And now, more than ever, he realized that he couldn't keep pretending his powers were just a joke. There was something bigger happening, something dangerous, and he was right in the middle of it. Whether he liked it or not, his powers had a hidden potential. And it was time to figure out exactly what that meant. Chapter 10, Breaking Point. Max Walker had never thought of himself as a hero. The past few weeks had been proof enough of that. His powers, strange and unpredictable as they were, had saved him and Emily more than once, but they had also caused countless disasters. Now, as the danger escalated, Max was beginning to feel the weight of those failures more than ever. Each time his powers went haywire, it chipped away at the fragile confidence he had been building. The idea that he could be a hero was slipping away faster than he could hold on to it. And then, in one critical moment, it all came crashing down. It had been a few days since the fiasco at the high-security facility, where Max's powers had reacted uncontrollably to the strange device the thieves were using. Since then, Emily had been working tirelessly, following up on leads, tracking more stolen equipment, and trying to piece together the bigger picture. Max, meanwhile, had been struggling with his growing doubts. He sat alone in his apartment, staring blankly at the floor. His mind was filled with images of the warehouse heist, the stolen military tech, and the men chasing him and Emily through the industrial park. But more than anything, he kept replaying the moment when his powers had spiraled out of control, throwing crates around like a kid having a temper tantrum. He hadn't meant to do it. He hadn't been able to stop it. What's the point of having powers if they just make everything worse? He had thought that maybe, just maybe, he could figure out how to control his abilities and use them for something good. But every time he tried, they either didn't work at all or they went off the rails, putting everyone around him in danger. It was getting harder to believe that he could ever be the hero he wanted to be. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Emily. Emily. Max, we've got a problem. Meet me at the usual spot. Max let out a long breath, grabbed his jacket, and headed out the door. Emily's messages had become increasingly urgent over the past few days, and he knew whatever was going on now was serious. When Max arrived at Gus's diner, Emily was already there, hunched over her laptop with a coffee cup in hand. She looked up when he slid into the booth, her face lined with worry. "We're running out of time." Max frowned, glancing at the laptop screen, which showed a map of the city with red markers scattered across it. "What's going on?" Emily pushed a folder of documents across the table toward him. "I've been tracking the thefts, and it's worse than we thought. They're ramping up. More equipment, more dangerous tech. They're targeting a shipment tonight, and if they get what they need. I don't even want to think about what could happen." Max's stomach twisted as he looked at the documents. "Do we know what they're building yet?" Emily shook her head, her frustration clear. "Not exactly, but it's big. Military-grade components, experimental tech, it's not just a weapon. It's something more sophisticated, something designed to control or disable large systems." Max felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever they were building, it wasn't just a threat to the city, it was a threat to everyone. "So, what's the plan?" "We stop them tonight." Emily nodded, her eyes dark with determination. "Yeah. I've got the location. A warehouse near the docks. It's heavily guarded, but this might be our only chance to stop them before it's too late." Max nodded, trying to push aside the doubt gnawing at him. "All right. Let's do this." As they approached the warehouse later that night, Max's heart pounded in his chest. The docks were quiet, save for the occasional rumble of distant ships and the soft crash of waves against the pier. The warehouse itself was a hulking, shadowy structure, its windows dark. There were no obvious signs of activity, but Max knew better. The thieves wouldn't be far. They've already started moving the shipment. "We need to be careful. There's no way we're getting in unnoticed, but we can't let them get away with this." Max swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he peered around the corner of a shipping container. His powers hummed beneath his skin, buzzing with an energy he couldn't quite control. He hated this feeling, the uncertainty, the fear that any second his abilities would turn on him instead of helping. But he couldn't back out now. Emily was counting on him. They moved silently toward the back entrance of the warehouse, ducking behind crates and containers as they went. Max's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the thieves. They didn't have to wait long. A group of men, dressed in black and heavily armed, emerged from the shadows, unloading crates from a truck parked by the dock. The equipment they were moving looked high-tech, far more advanced than anything Max had seen before. He felt a sinking feeling in his gut. "That's the shipment. We need to stop them before they get it on the boat." Max nodded, his hands shaking as he tried to focus. He could feel the energy building up inside him, but he couldn't afford to lose control now. He had to keep it together. Come on, Max. You can do this. They moved in closer, staying low behind a row of crates. Emily had a plan to block the exit with one of the larger shipping containers, trapping the thieves inside the warehouse. Max was supposed to use his powers to help push the container into place, cutting off their escape route. It seemed simple enough in theory. But as Max reached out with his mind, focusing on the heavy metal container, the familiar tingling sensation turned into something more, something sharper, more painful. He tried to concentrate, but the energy was slipping out of his control again, like trying to hold on to water with his hands. The container shifted slightly, scraping against the pavement, but then it stopped. Max gritted his teeth, pushing harder, trying to regain control. But the more he tried, the more chaotic the energy became, twisting inside him like a live wire. Suddenly, the container jerked violently, crashing into a stack of nearby crates with a deafening bang. The noise echoed through the warehouse, shattering the silence. We've been spotted. Move. Max's heart sank as the thieves scrambled, grabbing their weapons and preparing to make their escape. He had blown it. Again. Max, we need to stop them. Can you? But Max wasn't listening. His powers were spiraling out of control, the energy surging through him like an electrical storm. He tried to grab hold of it, to rein it in, but it was too much. His vision blurred, and the warehouse seemed to tilt around him. Without warning, a blast of energy shot out from Max, slamming into the side of the truck and sending it skidding across the dock. The force of the blast knocked several of the thieves off their feet, but it also sent a nearby crane toppling over, crashing into the water with a deafening roar. No, no, no. Emily grabbed his arm, pulling him back behind cover as gunfire erupted. Max, get it together. We need you. But Max couldn't think straight. His powers were raging out of control, and he couldn't stop them. Every time he tried to focus, another wave of chaotic energy rippled through him, sending more crates flying, shattering windows, and tearing through the warehouse like a tornado. The thieves, disoriented but determined, fired wildly as they tried to flee. One of them shouted orders, directing the others to secure the equipment. They were making a break for the boat, and Max knew if they got away, it was over. But he couldn't move. He couldn't control his powers. And worse, he was terrified that if he tried again, he'd only make things worse. I can't do this. I'm not. Emily's voice cut through his panic. Max. You're the only one who can stop them. I need you to try. Max looked at her, his vision blurry, his heart pounding. He wanted to help. He wanted to be the hero. But right now, all he could see were the people he was putting in danger, Emily, the dock workers, the people in the city. His powers weren't helping, they were destroying everything. For the first time, Max realized he wasn't cut out for this. He wasn't a hero. He was a walking disaster. In the chaos that followed, Emily managed to stop one of the trucks from escaping, using her quick thinking to block the road with a stack of crates. But most of the thieves got away, and so did a large portion of the equipment. As the dust settled and the police arrived, Max stayed behind, slumped against the warehouse wall, numb. Emily walked over to him, her face etched with exhaustion and disappointment. Max, are you all right? Max didn't look at her. No. I'm not. Emily knelt down beside him, her voice gentle but firm. You did your best. We didn't stop all of them, but you saved lives tonight. Max shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. No. I ruined everything. My powers. I can't control them. I'm dangerous. I'm not a hero, Emily. I'm just a mess. Emily's expression softened as she looked at him. You're not a mess, Max. You're still figuring things out. But you can't give up. Not now. Max didn't respond. He didn't have the strength to argue. All he could think about was how badly he had failed. How every time he tried to help, it only made things worse. The thought of ever using his powers again filled him with dread. For the first time since this whole thing had started, Max wasn't sure if he could keep going. And deep down, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Chapter 11, Heroes Don't Always Win. Max Walker had never been so sure of his failure. Every attempt to be a hero, to control his powers, to help Emily in stopping the growing criminal threat had led to disaster. Now, standing on the edge of a confrontation that would decide everything, Max couldn't shake the certainty that this time would be no different. Only this time, the consequences would be much, much worse. The days following the warehouse debacle had been quiet, too quiet. Max had barely spoken to Emily, avoiding her calls and texts as he tried to come to terms with the mess he had made. He wasn't sure if he could face her again, knowing he had been the reason the thieves escaped with so much of the stolen tech. She deserved someone competent, someone who could actually help. And then, just when Max was at his lowest, Emily had shown up at his apartment. We need to talk. Max had tried to avoid the conversation, but there was no escaping her determination. She had stormed into his apartment, her eyes blazing with frustration and concern. You've been avoiding me for days. We can't afford to waste time, Max. The people behind these thefts, they're getting closer to whatever they're building, and we're running out of time to stop them. Max had slumped onto his couch, feeling the weight of everything crashing down on him. I'm not the person to stop them, Emily. I've tried. You've seen what happens. My powers, they're a mess. I'm a mess. Every time I try to help, I just make things worse. Emily's voice had softened then, her frustration giving way to something gentler. She sat beside him, her eyes locking onto his. Max, I get it. You're scared. You think you're failing. But you've done more than you realize. You've saved lives. You've stopped people from getting hurt. Maybe your powers aren't perfect, but you can't give up now. Not when we're this close. Max had shaken his head, refusing to believe her words. But what if I can't stop them? What if I fail again? Emily's gaze had hardened, her resolve unshaken. Then we keep trying. That's what heroes do, Max. They don't always win. But they never stop fighting. Those words had stayed with Max long after Emily had left. And despite the doubts that still gnawed at him, something in the way she had spoken made him feel like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. But now, as he stood in the shadows of a massive, decrepit warehouse on the outskirts of the city, waiting for the inevitable confrontation, Max's doubts came crashing back in full force. The information Emily had uncovered over the past few days had been chilling. The group behind the thefts was bigger and more organized than they had initially thought. And worse, the weapon they were building, a powerful, military-grade device capable of controlling entire infrastructure systems, was almost complete. Tonight, the final components were set to be delivered. If they succeeded in getting them, the weapon would be operational. Max glanced over at Emily, who was crouched beside him, watching the warehouse through binoculars. Her face was tense, her determination palpable. She hadn't wavered in her belief that they could stop this. Max wished he could share her confidence. Are you sure this is the place? Emily nodded, her voice quiet but firm. This is it. I intercepted a transmission earlier today. They're moving the final parts here tonight. Max swallowed hard, trying to control the nervous energy that surged through him. His powers had been quiet since the incident at the docks, but he could feel them stirring again, restless and unpredictable. Okay. What's the plan? Emily looked at him, her expression grim. We cut them off before the shipment gets inside. If we can stop them from delivering the parts, we'll have time to alert the authorities and dismantle what they've built. We can't let them get away this time. Max nodded, trying to push down the fear gnawing at him. He had already failed once, and the thought of failing again, especially with stakes this high, made his stomach churn. As they crept closer to the warehouse, the sound of trucks rumbling into the yard echoed through the night. Max tensed, his heart pounding. This was it. The final confrontation. If they didn't stop the shipment tonight, the city would be at the mercy of the weapon these criminals were building. Emily motioned for Max to follow her as they moved closer, keeping to the shadows. Max's pulse quickened as they neared the edge of the yard, where they could see the trucks being unloaded by a group of heavily armed men. Max's hands trembled as he watched them. His powers buzzed beneath his skin, that familiar energy crackling inside him. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. This time, he couldn't lose control. This time, he had to get it right. But then, from the corner of his eye, Max spotted something that made his blood run cold. At the far end of the yard, standing near one of the trucks, was a man dressed in all black, his face hidden by a mask. He was giving orders, directing the others with precise authority. Max recognized him instantly. It was the clumsy villain he had encountered weeks ago, the man in the cheap costume who had fumbled through their first encounter. But this time, something was different. He wasn't clumsy or out of place anymore. He moved with confidence, with purpose. It's him. The guy from before. Emily frowned, following Max's gaze. That's the leader. He's the one behind all of this. Max's heart pounded in his chest. This was the man who had orchestrated the entire operation, the one who had stolen all the tech, the one who was about to activate a weapon that could bring the city to its knees. And Max was supposed to stop him. As the trucks were unloaded and the men prepared to move the final components inside the warehouse, Emily gave Max the signal. It was time to move. Max took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His powers hummed, eager to be unleashed, but he knew better than to trust them completely. He had to be careful, had to stay in control. They made their way toward the trucks, using the chaos of the unloading process to stay hidden. Emily darted forward, positioning herself near the rear of one of the vehicles, while Max moved toward the front, trying to get a better view of the man in black. And that's when everything went wrong. Max had barely taken 2 steps when his powers surged, unbidden and uncontrollable. A wave of energy shot out from him, hitting the side of one of the trucks with a loud crash. The force of the blast knocked over several crates, sending equipment spilling onto the ground. No. Not now. The men in the yard froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. The man in black turned, his eyes narrowing behind his mask as he spotted Max. Get him. Max's heart leapt into his throat as the armed men rushed toward him. His powers flared again, but instead of helping him fight back, they went haywire. A nearby stack of crates exploded, sending debris flying in every direction. Max tried to control it, but the energy was slipping through his fingers, wild and destructive. Come on, focus. But it was too late. The men were closing in on him, and Max was losing control faster than he could regain it. He felt a sharp pain in his chest as something hit him, a baton, hard and fast. He staggered backward, his vision blurring. No. I can't. I have to. Emily's voice echoed somewhere in the distance, shouting his name, but Max couldn't focus. The world was spinning, his powers surging and retreating like a storm out of control. Every time he tried to use them, they lashed out unpredictably, causing more damage than good. And then, in the midst of the chaos, Max saw him, the man in black. He was standing just a few feet away, watching Max with cold, calculating eyes. Some hero you turned out to be. Max struggled to stay on his feet, his body aching, his mind reeling. He had failed. Again. And this time, there was no coming back from it. The man in black raised his hand, a small device glinting in the moonlight. Max recognized it immediately. It was the same kind of device he had seen at the earlier heists, the one that had triggered his powers to go haywire. Say goodbye, hero. Before Max could react, the device activated, sending a pulse of energy through the air. Max felt it hit him like a tidal wave, overwhelming his senses, tearing through his already fragile control. His powers exploded outward, uncontrolled and devastating. The last thing Max saw before everything went dark was the warehouse collapsing, debris raining down as the ground shook beneath him. And then, nothing. When Max awoke, he was lying in the rubble, his body battered and broken. The warehouse was in ruins, smoke rising from the wreckage. He could hear sirens in the distance, the faint sound of Emily's voice calling his name. But all Max could feel was the weight of his failure. He hadn't stopped the villain. He hadn't saved anyone. He had lost. Heroes don't always win. And tonight, Max Walker had lost everything. Chapter 12, A Secret Power Revealed. Max Walker lay in the rubble of the collapsed warehouse, every inch of his body aching. His mind was hazy, struggling to make sense of the devastation around him. The last thing he remembered was the blast, the pulse of energy from the villain's device that had torn through his already fragile control, turning his powers into a destructive force. He had failed, again. But something had changed. There was a strange hum in the back of his mind, a distant buzz he couldn't quite place. His senses were dulled, but as he blinked through the dust and debris, he felt an unfamiliar sensation, a deep pull, like something inside him had awoken. What happened? He tried to move, but his body was heavy, weighed down by the wreckage. His muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed through the pain, forcing himself into a sitting position. The warehouse was in ruins, the once massive structure now a crumbled shell. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the wail of sirens drawing closer. As he struggled to get his bearings, he saw her, Emily. She was running toward him, her face a mix of relief and fear. Max. Are you okay? Max tried to nod, but the effort made his head spin. Yeah. I'm fine. But he wasn't fine. Something was off, something deep within him was shifting, churning. It felt like his powers were still active, still buzzing beneath the surface, but they weren't out of control like before. They felt different. We need to get you out of here. The whole place could collapse any second. Max nodded, though he wasn't sure he could even stand. He reached out to steady himself, his hand gripping a twisted metal beam. The moment his fingers touched the cold steel, something strange happened. The beam trembled beneath his grip, vibrating as if responding to his touch. Max's eyes widened in shock. He wasn't doing this, at least, not consciously. But the metal was reacting to him, bending ever so slightly, as if it were connected to his will. What the? Emily didn't seem to notice. She was too busy trying to find a way through the wreckage, her focus entirely on getting them out. But Max couldn't take his eyes off the metal beam, still shaking beneath his hand. Something had changed. His powers were different now, more responsive, more controlled. Okay, this is new. By the time they made it out of the wreckage, the sirens had grown louder. Emergency responders were already arriving on the scene, but Max and Emily stayed out of sight, slipping away from the chaos before anyone could notice them. They ended up in a nearby alley, where Emily finally turned to him, her eyes filled with concern. "Max, you're hurt. We need to get you to a hospital." Max shook his head, still processing what had just happened. His body ached, and he was exhausted, but there was something else at play, something far more important. "Emily, something's changed. My powers, they're different now." Emily frowned, her worry deepening. "What do you mean?" Max held up his hand, still trembling slightly from the shock of the earlier events. "When I touched that metal back there, it moved. Like, I didn't mean to do it, but it responded to me. I wasn't just throwing things around like before. I think I can control it now." Emily stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You're saying your powers have evolved?" Max nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure how to explain it. "I don't know. It's like they're stronger now. More focused. Before, everything was chaotic, I couldn't control it. But now, it feels like there's more to it. Like I've unlocked something." Emily's eyes widened as realization dawned on her. It must have been the device. That pulse of energy, it did something to you. Max's mind raced. Could the villain's device have triggered this change? He had always known his powers were strange, but if they had been dormant or limited before, maybe the device had forced them to evolve. So that's it. The device didn't just knock me out, it woke something up. There's more to my powers than I realized. Emily's face lit up with a mix of hope and determination. "Max, this could change everything. If you can control your powers now, if they're stronger, you might be able to stop them." Max hesitated. The idea of having stronger, more controlled powers was exciting, but it also terrified him. What if he couldn't handle it? What if they became too much? But Emily was right. If he had any chance of stopping the villain, of preventing the weapon from being completed, he had to understand this new aspect of his abilities. "Then we need to figure out exactly what I can do." Over the next few days, Max and Emily worked together, testing the limits of his newly evolved powers. At first, Max was cautious, afraid that he might lose control again. But to his surprise, his abilities seemed far more stable than before. He no longer had to fight against the chaotic surges of energy. Instead, the power flowed through him smoothly, responding to his thoughts and intentions. It started small. Max would reach out with his mind, focusing on small objects, paper clips, coffee mugs, anything he could find, and they would move at his command. But this time, they didn't fly off in random directions or explode into pieces. They moved exactly where he wanted them to go. "This is incredible." Emily watched him, her eyes wide with awe. "You're getting better every day. It's like you're finally in control." Max nodded, still in disbelief at how far he had come. "It's not just control. I think my powers have grown. They're stronger now, more precise." Emily leaned forward, her excitement growing. "Then maybe it's time to test them on something bigger." Max's grin faltered slightly. Testing his powers on small objects was one thing, but moving larger things, heavier, more dangerous objects, was a different story. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that yet. "Are you sure?" I don't want to mess this up. Emily placed a hand on his arm, her gaze steady and reassuring. You've got this, Max. I believe in you. Max took a deep breath, nodding. He had come this far. It was time to see just how far his powers could go. They found an empty construction site on the outskirts of the city, a place where Max could test his abilities without worrying about collateral damage. The area was full of large steel beams, concrete slabs, and heavy machinery, perfect for pushing the limits of his strength. Max stood in the center of the site, his heart pounding as he focused on a large steel beam lying on the ground. It was heavy, far heavier than anything he had ever tried to lift with his powers before. Come on, you can do this. He reached out with his mind, feeling the familiar buzz of energy building inside him. This time, instead of the chaotic surge he had grown used to, the power flowed smoothly, like a steady current. Max focused on the beam, willing it to lift off the ground. At first, nothing happened. Max clenched his fists, focusing harder, pushing the energy outward. Slowly, the beam began to tremble, then it lifted, just a few inches at first, but then higher and higher until it hovered several feet above the ground. I did it. Emily watched in awe as Max controlled the beam with precision, moving it through the air as if it weighed nothing. He felt the power coursing through him, strong and steady. For the first time in his life, Max wasn't afraid of his powers. He was in control. Max, this is incredible. You're stronger than you ever were before. Max nodded, his confidence growing. This changes everything. We can stop them now. We can stop the weapon. With his newfound control over his powers, Max felt ready to face the villain again. He and Emily spent the next few days tracking down the group's movements, piecing together the final pieces of their plan. It wasn't long before they discovered that the weapon, now almost complete, was being moved to a secret location for its final assembly. Max knew this was their last chance. If the weapon became operational, the city, possibly the entire country, would be in danger. The night of the final confrontation arrived quickly. Max and Emily stood outside the abandoned factory where the group had holed up, preparing to move the weapon. Max's heart raced, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of anticipation. This ends tonight. Emily nodded, her expression serious but full of belief in him. We're stopping them. Together. As they approached the factory, Max could feel the familiar hum of his powers, but this time, they weren't chaotic or overwhelming. They were steady, ready for whatever lay ahead. And for the first time, Max felt like a true hero. Inside the factory, the air crackled with tension. The villain, the man in black, stood at the center of the room, overseeing the final preparations for the weapon. His mask hid his expression, but Max could sense the confidence radiating off him. He believed he had already won. But Max knew better. As soon as they entered the room, the villain's eyes locked onto Max. You again. I thought I finished you last time. Max stepped forward, his powers crackling beneath his skin. You didn't. But I'm going to finish this. The villain chuckled darkly, raising the same device he had used before. Let's see if you've learned anything since our last encounter. He activated the device, sending a pulse of energy through the room. But this time, Max was ready. The energy hit him, but instead of destabilizing his powers, it only made them stronger. Max could feel the surge, the increase in strength, but he was in control. With a single thought, Max sent a wave of energy toward the villain, knocking the device from his hand and sending him crashing into a stack of crates. What? How? Max stepped forward, his confidence unshakable. Things have changed. With a flick of his wrist, Max lifted the heavy steel beams scattered around the factory, using them to dismantle the weapon piece by piece. The villain watched in disbelief as his carefully laid plans crumbled before him. "It's over." The villain scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild with fury. "No. You can't stop this." But it was already too late. With a final push, Max sent the last pieces of the weapon crashing to the ground, destroying it completely. As the room fell silent, Max turned to face the villain, who was now on his knees, defeated. "I can, and I did." For the first time in his life, Max felt like a hero, a real hero. And as he stood there, Emily at his side, Max knew that his journey was far from over. But now, with his powers fully realized, he was ready for whatever came next. Because a hero's power wasn't just about strength. It was about control. Chapter 13, Against All Odds. Max Walker had never felt power like this. The surge of energy that once overwhelmed and controlled him now hummed through his veins with a steady, purposeful rhythm. In just a few days, Max had gone from doubting everything about his abilities to finally mastering them. And now, as the city stood on the edge of chaos, he knew one thing for sure: he was ready. But the real test was still ahead. The villain may have been defeated at the abandoned factory, but Max and Emily knew that wasn't the end. The criminal organization behind the stolen tech and the secret weapon was still at large, and they were planning something bigger. Much bigger. It was time for the final battle, the moment where everything would be decided. This is it. No more running, no more second-guessing. It's time to finish what we started. The morning after their victory at the factory, Max and Emily gathered at the Chicago Gazette to regroup. Emily's office had become their war room, filled with maps, notes, and data they had compiled over the past few weeks. They had pieced together enough to know that the organization's true leader, the mastermind pulling the strings, was still out there, preparing for the final phase of their plan. Emily sat at her desk, typing furiously on her laptop, her face lit by the glow of the screen. Max stood nearby, looking over the latest intel Emily had uncovered. "We stopped the weapon, but they're still moving. From what I've found, they're planning something massive, something that could cripple the entire city. But I can't figure out where or when it's going to happen." Max nodded, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "They're not going to stop. We have to stay ahead of them. There's too much at stake." Emily glanced at him, her expression softening. She could see how much he had changed in the past few days. The doubt and hesitation that had once clouded his face were gone. Now, Max stood tall, his confidence growing with every step. "You've come a long way, Max. I know you've got this." Max gave her a small smile, grateful for her belief in him. "I won't let you down." Just then, Emily's phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at it, her eyes narrowing as she read the message. "It's a tip from one of my contacts. They've tracked down the group's final base of operations. It's outside the city, in an old military bunker that was decommissioned years ago. They're making their move tonight." Max's heart raced. This was it, the final confrontation. Everything they had fought for, everything they had endured, was leading to this moment. "We end this tonight." As the sun set over the city, Max and Emily prepared for the mission ahead. The decommissioned military bunker was located deep in the forest, miles away from the city. It was the perfect hideout, isolated, heavily fortified, and far enough from prying eyes that they could operate undisturbed. Max and Emily knew this wouldn't be easy, but they had no choice. If they didn't stop the organization tonight, the consequences could be catastrophic. They geared up in silence, the tension between them thick with unspoken resolve. Emily checked her equipment, flashlights, a map, a small communication device that linked them to a few trusted contacts in law enforcement. Max stood beside her, mentally preparing himself for the battle ahead. "Are you ready for this?" Max took a deep breath, feeling the hum of his powers as they responded to his focus. He was no longer afraid of them, no longer unsure. This time, he was in control. "Yeah. I'm ready." The drive to the bunker was long and tense. They traveled in near silence, the weight of the mission hanging over them. Max stared out the window as the city lights faded into the distance, replaced by the shadowy outlines of trees and hills. His mind was focused, his thoughts sharp. This was their last chance to stop the organization before they unleashed whatever they had been building. When they finally arrived at the outskirts of the bunker, the night was eerily quiet. The bunker loomed ahead, hidden beneath the cover of the forest. It was an imposing structure, cold, dark, and foreboding. "There are guards everywhere. We'll have to be careful." Max nodded, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He could see the faint glow of flashlights moving through the trees, the silhouettes of armed guards patrolling the area. "I can handle the guards. You find a way inside. We need to stop them from launching whatever they've got planned." Emily hesitated for a moment, concern flickering in her eyes. "Max, don't take any unnecessary risks." Max gave her a reassuring smile. "I won't. I promise." Max moved silently through the trees, his powers humming just beneath the surface, ready to spring into action. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him, but for the first time, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like purpose. As he approached the first guard, Max focused his mind, sending a gentle wave of energy toward the man. The guard's flashlight flickered, and he paused, looking around in confusion. Max seized the moment, using his powers to push the guard backward, sending him crashing softly into the bushes, unconscious but unharmed. One down. Max moved quickly, dispatching the remaining guards with precision. He didn't need brute force anymore, his powers were refined, controlled. Each guard fell silently, leaving the perimeter unprotected. With the guards out of the way, Max signaled to Emily, who was waiting nearby. She nodded and began making her way toward the entrance of the bunker. Inside the bunker, the air was cold and damp, the walls lined with old, rusted equipment from a time long past. The deeper they ventured, the more ominous the place became. Max could feel the tension building, the sense that something terrible was about to happen. As they crept through the winding corridors, they could hear voices, faint at first, but growing louder as they approached the heart of the bunker. Max's pulse quickened. They were close. Suddenly, Emily froze, holding up a hand to stop Max. She pointed ahead, where a group of armed men stood gathered around a large, complex machine that hummed with a low, mechanical sound. At the center of the group stood a figure Max hadn't seen before, a tall, imposing man with a calm, controlled demeanor. "That's him. The leader." Emily nodded grimly. "We need to stop them before they finish." Max took a deep breath, focusing his mind. This was the moment he had been preparing for, the final battle. He could feel the energy inside him, powerful and ready to be unleashed. But this time, it wasn't wild or chaotic. It was steady, waiting for his command. With a single nod to Emily, Max stepped out from the shadows. "Stop right there." The men turned, startled by Max's sudden appearance. The leader's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his calm composure never faltering. "So, you're the one who's been causing us so much trouble." Max stood his ground, his powers buzzing just beneath the surface. I'm here to stop you. Whatever you're planning, it ends now. The leader chuckled softly, shaking his head. You think you can stop this? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Max clenched his fists, feeling the energy surge through him. I know enough. And I'm not going to let you destroy this city. The leader's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. Then I suppose we're at an impasse. With a flick of his wrist, the leader activated the machine behind him. It roared to life, filling the room with a deafening hum as its mechanical arms whirred into action. Max felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, but he didn't flinch. This time, he was ready. The guards rushed forward, but Max was faster. With a single, controlled motion, he sent a wave of energy crashing into them, knocking them off their feet and scattering their weapons across the floor. The leader's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly recovered, barking orders to his men as they scrambled to fight back. Max moved through the chaos with precision, using his powers to deflect bullets, disarm attackers, and disable the machinery. He was no longer the uncertain, bumbling hero of the past. He was focused, confident, and in control. As the battle raged on, Max locked eyes with the leader. The man's calm facade was cracking, and Max could see the fear creeping into his expression. It's over. You can't win. The leader sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. You think this is the end? You're just a kid with a few tricks. You'll never understand the power you're up against. Max's eyes narrowed, his determination unshakable. I don't need to understand it. I just need to stop you. With that, Max unleashed a final, powerful surge of energy, sending the leader crashing into the control panel. The machine sputtered, its mechanical arms grinding to a halt as sparks flew from its circuitry. The room fell silent. The guards lay unconscious on the floor, and the machine, the weapon that had threatened the entire city, was destroyed. Max stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, but victorious. As the dust settled, Emily ran to Max's side, her face a mixture of relief and awe. You did it, Max. You stopped them. Max nodded, still catching his breath. We did it. Together. For the first time, Max felt a sense of peace wash over him. The doubts that had plagued him for so long were gone. He had faced his greatest challenge and come out on top, not because of his powers, but because he had finally believed in himself. As they made their way out of the bunker, the night air cool against their skin, Max knew that this was just the beginning. The journey ahead would be long, and there would be more battles to fight. But now, he had the confidence, and the strength, to face whatever came next. Against all odds, Max Walker had become the hero he was always meant to be. Chapter 14, The Final Showdown. The night sky was alive with tension. Clouds hung low over the city, swirling in thick masses as if nature itself sensed the impending clash. Max Walker stood on the roof of a high-rise, staring into the distance where the lights of downtown Chicago glimmered against the backdrop of an approaching storm. He had come so far, faced countless failures, learned to control his powers, and stopped a weapon that could have destroyed the city. But the real battle was just beginning. Somewhere out there, the true mastermind behind all of the chaos was waiting, and Max knew this final confrontation would be unlike anything he had faced before. His newly awakened powers buzzed beneath his skin, ready for whatever came next, but there was still a quiet fear that lingered. His journey had been long and unpredictable, full of missteps and accidents, but now it was clear, everything had been leading to this moment. This is it. One last fight. Earlier that evening, Max and Emily had uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. After dismantling the criminal organization's weapon at the bunker, they had learned that the mastermind, an enigmatic figure known only as Vector, was preparing to launch one final, catastrophic attack on the city. Vector's true identity had remained hidden for months, his every move orchestrated from the shadows. But now, his plan was clear. He intended to use his powers to disrupt the city's entire infrastructure, crippling communications, shutting down power grids, and plunging Chicago into chaos. Max had never faced an enemy like Vector. The man's abilities were rumored to be terrifyingly strong, capable of manipulating electrical and technological systems at will. Max wasn't sure how his own powers would hold up against such an opponent, but he had no choice. The fate of the city rested in his hands. He's going to strike tonight. I've traced the signal he's using to manipulate the grid. It's coming from somewhere near the top of the old Willis Tower. He's probably using the height to amplify his reach. Max had nodded, feeling the familiar surge of nerves in his gut. Then that's where I'll go. Emily had placed a hand on his arm, her expression both worried and hopeful. You don't have to do this alone, Max. But Max had shaken his head. I'm the only one who can stop him. This is my fight. Emily had stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding, her faith in him clear. Be careful. Now, standing on the rooftop of a nearby skyscraper, Max could see the dark silhouette of Willis Tower looming ahead. It rose above the rest of the city like a monolith, its top floors shrouded in clouds and flashing with occasional bursts of light. He could feel Vector's presence from here, an almost palpable disturbance in the air as the electrical systems in the city flickered and dimmed. I'm coming for you, Vector. With a deep breath, Max summoned his powers. The familiar energy surged through him, no longer chaotic and uncontrollable, but focused and steady. He crouched low, then leapt into the air, his telekinetic abilities propelling him across the gap between buildings with ease. The wind whipped past him as he soared through the night, his heart pounding with both adrenaline and anticipation. Max landed on the rooftop of Willis Tower with a soft thud, the concrete beneath his feet cracking slightly from the impact. The air was thick with electricity, and the storm clouds above rumbled ominously, flashing with bursts of lightning that seemed to crackle with unnatural intensity. At the far end of the rooftop stood Vector. The man was tall and lean, his face hidden beneath a sleek, black helmet that reflected the storm's lightning like a dark mirror. His entire body was encased in a high-tech suit that pulsed with glowing lines of blue and silver, and his hands crackled with arcs of electricity as he manipulated the air around him. Vector's presence was commanding, and even from across the rooftop, Max could feel the sheer power radiating from him. So, you're the one who's been meddling in my affairs. Max stepped forward, his fists clenched, the energy within him buzzing with anticipation. I'm here to stop you, Vector. This ends tonight. Vector chuckled softly, his voice echoing through the storm. You think you can stop me? You're nothing but a child playing with powers you don't understand. I am the future. This city, this entire world, will bow to my will. Max's eyes narrowed, his resolve hardening. He had faced failure before, he had doubted himself, but not anymore. Not now. You're wrong. You might control technology, but you don't control me. I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone again. Vector's amusement faded, replaced by cold anger. Then let's see what you're really made of. With a sudden burst of motion, Vector raised his arms, sending a torrent of electrical energy surging toward Max. The air crackled and hissed as the bolts of lightning shot across the rooftop, splitting the air with a deafening roar. Max barely had time to react. He raised his hand, instinctively summoning his powers, and the lightning curved around him, diverted by a shield of telekinetic energy. The force of the attack sent him skidding backward, but he held his ground, his mind racing as he adjusted to the intensity of Vector's power. Okay, time to hit back. Max thrust his hand forward, sending a wave of energy crashing toward Vector. The rooftop trembled as chunks of concrete and debris were ripped from the ground, hurtling toward the villain with tremendous force. But Vector was faster than Max had expected. With a flick of his wrist, Vector sent an arc of electricity through the air, disintegrating the debris before it could reach him. He followed up with another blast of lightning, this one aimed directly at Max's chest. Max ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding the attack, but the heat from the lightning sizzled through the air around him. He had never fought an opponent like this, someone who could manipulate the battlefield so easily, who could strike from a distance with such precision. Max knew he had to change his strategy. As Vector prepared for another strike, Max darted forward, using his telekinesis to launch himself into the air. He dodged another blast of electricity, then landed behind Vector, using his powers to send a shockwave of force through the ground. Vector staggered but quickly regained his footing. "You're more persistent than I thought." Max smirked, feeling a surge of confidence. "Get used to it." Vector growled and raised his arms again, summoning an even greater surge of energy. The storm clouds above intensified, lightning flashing across the sky as the power around them grew to a fever pitch. Max could feel the raw intensity of it, the air itself vibrating with electricity. This was it, the final test. Vector hurled a massive bolt of lightning at Max, but this time, Max was ready. Instead of dodging, he focused his mind, drawing on the newfound strength he had discovered in recent days. He raised his hand, and the lightning stopped mid-air, suspended by his telekinesis. Vector's eyes widened in shock. "What?" Max grinned, his confidence soaring. "Yeah, I've learned a few new tricks." With a swift motion, Max redirected the lightning, sending it crashing into the rooftop behind Vector. The explosion of concrete and steel sent the villain flying, slamming him into the side of the building. But Max didn't stop there. He pressed the advantage, using his powers to lift pieces of debris into the air, hurling them at Vector with precision. The villain struggled to regain his footing, his once confident demeanor crumbling as Max overwhelmed him with attack after attack. This isn't possible." Max stood tall, his powers crackling with energy as he prepared for the final strike. "You're done, Vector. It's over." Vector, battered and defeated, glared at Max through his helmet, his voice filled with venom. "I won't let you win." In a last-ditch effort, Vector raised his arms one final time, summoning all the power he had left. The storm above them roared to life, lightning striking the rooftop in rapid succession. Vector's body crackled with electricity as he unleashed his most devastating attack yet, sending a wave of energy so powerful that it threatened to tear the building apart. Max braced himself, feeling the ground shake beneath his feet. But he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Drawing on everything he had learned, everything he had endured, Max raised his hands and met Vector's attack head-on. The air around them exploded with energy, the force of their powers clashing in a blinding burst of light. For a moment, it seemed as though the world itself was splitting apart. But Max didn't falter. With a final surge of strength, he pushed through Vector's attack, his powers overwhelming the villains. The electricity around Vector sputtered and died, and the man collapsed to the ground, defeated. The storm above them faded, the clouds parting to reveal the night sky. Max stood over Vector, breathing heavily but victorious. "It's over." As the authorities arrived to take Vector into custody, Max stood on the edge of the rooftop, watching as the city lights sparkled in the distance. The fight was over, the city saved, and for the first time, Max felt the weight of his victory. Emily joined him, her expression a mix of pride and relief. "You did it, Max. You really did it." Max smiled, his heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment. "We did it." For so long, Max had doubted himself, questioned whether he had what it took to be a hero. But now, standing here with Emily by his side, he knew the truth. Even the most unlikely heroes could rise to the occasion. Against all odds, Max had won. And now, he was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 15, A Hero After All. The storm had passed. Max Walker stood on the rooftop, overlooking the city that sprawled beneath him like a sleeping giant. The lights of Chicago twinkled against the night sky, and a gentle breeze ruffled his hair. The chaos of the battle was behind him now, and the city was safe. Vector had been defeated, taken into custody by the authorities, and his plan to plunge the city into chaos had been dismantled. Max's powers had finally worked in his favor, and for the first time, he had felt like a true hero. But now, as he stood in the quiet aftermath, a deeper realization began to settle over him. It wasn't the strength of his powers that had made the difference. It wasn't the raw energy he had unleashed in the final battle. It was something else, something he hadn't fully understood until now. It's not about how strong you are. It's about how you use what you've got. Emily stood beside him, her arms crossed as she gazed out over the skyline. Her face was calm, but there was a glint of pride in her eyes, pride in what they had accomplished together. After everything they had been through, Max knew that she had been his rock, the one person who had believed in him when he couldn't even believe in himself. "You did it, Max. You stopped him. The city's safe because of you." Max turned to her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We did it. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Emily shrugged, but her smile widened. "Maybe. But you're the one who stood toe-to-toe with Vector. You're the one who found the strength when it mattered." Max's gaze fell to the ground for a moment. He had faced so much self-doubt, so many moments where he thought he wasn't good enough, where his powers had seemed like more of a curse than a gift. But now, standing on the other side of those battles, he realized that being a hero wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. "I used to think that being a hero meant having everything figured out. Having the right powers, being the strongest, the fastest, but that's not it. It's about knowing your limits, pushing through your fears, and doing what's right even when you don't know if you'll succeed." Emily nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "Exactly. It's not the powers that make the hero. It's how you use them. And you've done more than most people ever could." Max felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He had spent so much time doubting himself, thinking he wasn't cut out for this, but now, he finally saw things clearly. He wasn't the most powerful, the most skilled, or the most experienced. But he had found a way to make a difference. He had found a way to stand up and fight when it mattered most. And that's what made him a hero. As they left the rooftop and made their way back down to the street, Max couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The streets were quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos they had faced only hours before. He and Emily walked side by side, the weight of their victory hanging between them like a quiet, shared secret. They stopped at a small coffee shop, one of those 24-hour joints that seemed to always be open, no matter the time or the day. Inside, the soft hum of conversation and the smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted them. It was a welcome return to normalcy after everything they had been through. "I still can't believe we actually did it. I thought for sure Vector had the upper hand with that machine." Max sat across from her, running a hand through his hair. "So did I, honestly. I mean, there were a few moments there where I thought it was over. Emily leaned forward, her eyes twinkling. But you didn't give up. That's the difference. You kept fighting. Max shrugged, still trying to wrap his head around the fact that he had actually won. I guess. I just did what I had to do. Emily sipped her coffee, her smile never fading. That's exactly what a hero does. Max looked down at the table, feeling a strange mix of pride and humility. He wasn't used to being called a hero. For so long, he had seen himself as the guy who couldn't get it right, the guy whose powers always caused more problems than they solved. But now, things were different. He had found his way. I never thought I could actually do it. I always thought that being a hero meant being perfect. That I'd never be good enough. Emily reached across the table, placing her hand over his. No one's perfect, Max. But you're good enough. More than good enough. Max looked up at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. It had been a long road, full of stumbles and failures, but he had finally made it to the other side. And through it all, Emily had been there, pushing him forward, helping him see that he had the strength inside him all along. Thanks, Emily. For everything. Emily squeezed his hand before pulling away, her expression soft. Anytime, hero. As the days passed, life in the city slowly returned to normal. The chaos caused by Vector's attempted attack faded into the background, and the city's infrastructure was restored. For most of Chicago's residents, it was just another crisis averted, another brush with disaster that they would soon forget. But for Max, things had changed forever. In the aftermath of the battle, Max found himself growing into his role as a protector of the city. He still wasn't sure about calling himself a superhero, but he had embraced the idea that he could make a difference. He had learned to trust his powers, to control them in ways he never thought possible. And more importantly, he had learned to trust himself. The weeks that followed were full of small victories. Max stopped a bank robbery, helped rescue a group of people trapped in a collapsed building, and even foiled a minor heist at a local electronics store. Each time, his confidence grew, and his control over his powers became sharper, more refined. But through it all, Max never forgot the lesson he had learned on that rooftop. Being a hero isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, doing your best, and never giving up. One evening, after a long day of patrolling the city, Max found himself back at Gus's diner, the place where it had all started. He sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee, lost in thought. The hum of the diner's regulars surrounded him, but for once, Max felt at peace. He had come so far, and yet he knew there was still so much more to learn, so much more to do. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but that was okay. He had faced doubt, fear, and failure before, and he had come out stronger on the other side. As Max sat there, staring out the window at the bustling city beyond, a voice interrupted his thoughts. Look at you, big shot. Saving the city, drinking coffee like it's no big deal. Max turned to his best friend, a grin spreading across his face. Hey, someone's gotta keep this place safe. Ben smirked, giving Max a playful nudge. Yeah. You know, I always knew you had it in you. Took you long enough to figure it out, though. Max chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, well, better late than never. Ben leaned back in his seat, his tone becoming more sincere. Seriously, though. You did good, Max, real good. Max nodded, feeling a surge of pride at his friend's words. It had been a long journey, full of ups and downs, but he had made it. And now, as he sat in that familiar diner, surrounded by the people and city he had fought to protect, Max finally understood what it meant to be a hero. It wasn't about having the strongest powers, or the coolest gadgets, or even the biggest victories. It was about using what you had, no matter how imperfect, with courage, determination, and heart. Max Walker might not have been the hero the city expected. But he had become the hero it needed. Maybe I am a hero after all. As he took a sip of his coffee and watched the city outside, Max knew that his story was far from over. This was only the beginning. What did you think of the ending? How do you feel about Max's transformation from a doubtful hero to who he is now? I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions in the comments. Your feedback means a lot. If you enjoyed the story, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more exciting adventures.